in Cuba to enter the final phase prior to its definite approval. We have our second vaccine candidate authorized to begin its phase 3 clinical trials. This is something that really motivates us and provides us with lots of energy to keep working. Cuba is producing the Abdala vaccine candidate on an industrial scale and will begin its application with 3 doses during the month to 48,000 volunteers in 3 cities in the eastern part of the country. If satisfactory results are achieved, the requests for emergency use authorization will follow.
It will open the regulatory path, also approved in Cuba, to extend the vaccination process to the entire population.
Meanwhile, the Soberana O2 vaccine candidate continues its final stage of trials with 44,000 volunteers in Havana. 150,000 frontline health workers will also be vaccinated with the vaccine to evaluate the effects in at-risk populations. Cuba has the goal to immunize its entire population, more than 11.2 million people, this year. We are preparing to produce between 1 and 2 million doses per month, on average, and this will allow us to vaccinate the population in about 6 months, because the country needs 30 million. Applying the same recombinant protein technique used by the United States biotechnology company Novavax, Cuba is developing 5 vaccine candidates, and whichever receives official approval will become the first vaccine against COVID-19 to be developed and produced in Latin America.
Rolando Segura, TeleSUR.
The Haitian people continue to mobilize against the government of President Jovenel Moïse. In the context of a call for an International Day of Solidarity with the Haitian people, political and human rights organizations are mobilizing in different cities around the country in order to call for President Moïse to step down, as they argue his constitutional term in office ended in February. Lawyers and Supreme Court judges have also joined the demonstrations. President of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, participated in an event to honor the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo this Tuesday as part of the upcoming 45th anniversary of the human rights movement. The Argentine head of state led the ceremony from the Bicentennial Museum of the Presidential Palace, where he paid tribute to the mothers of Plaza de Mayo who gathered virtually from different parts of the country. 40 mothers and grandmothers of the association were awarded by the president with the Juana Arzurdi Prize for their tireless efforts in the defense of human rights and to seek justice for the crimes against humanity committed by the military dictatorship that seized power on March 24, 1976.
Sometimes I wonder whether we will have to keep teaching our youth, because many of them do not understand. Thank God, we have been fighting for 45 years after that terrible coup, and there have been many years of democracy after that. Young people do not understand how scary and depraved the violence has been.
Every March 23rd, Bolivia observes the Day of the Sea, which serves as an opportunity to reiterate its right of access to the Pacific Ocean. On this date, Bolivia reaffirms its sovereign and legal rights to a coastline of which it was deprived by Chile and assures to continue with the efforts to solve this legal conflict with the neighbouring country. To mark the date, the Bolivian Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a statement this Tuesday highlighting the peaceful efforts and demands for sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean. The text explains that in 1825, Bolivia had an extensive coastline of more than 400 kilometres along the Pacific Ocean. However, in 1879, a war with Chile, sponsored by foreign interests, followed by the enforcement of the 1904 treaty, stripped the country of its maritime sovereignty. And Bolivian President Luis Arce announced that he will resume bilateral relations with Chile in order to ensure the country has sovereign access to the sea. The Bolivian head of state made the statements during the commemoration of the 142nd anniversary of Bolivia's loss of sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean as a result of an invasion by Chile and later annexation of part of the country's territory. From La Paz City, President Arce highlighted that Bolivia's sovereign access to the sea remains an unresolved issue. He also recalled that the decision of the International Court of Justice on the matter does not prevent the country from resuming the dialogue with Chile and stressed that any rapprochement must be based on the perspective of regional integration. Nicaragua is celebrating the 41st anniversary of the literacy campaign launched in 1980 by the Sandinista government. Vice President Osorio Murillo highlighted that the Ministry of Education would carry out activities to mark the anniversary of the educational campaign this Tuesday, noting that the main event would be held in the National Palace, the site from which the brigadistas that were tasked with the teaching illiteracy to thousands across the country set off back in 1980 to begin the campaign. The National Literacy Campaign reduced the illiteracy rate in the country from 50 to 12.9% and was recognised by UNESCO, which awarded the country for the successful campaign. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away.
为了保持身体健康，我冥想。
Para mantenerme saludable, yo corro.
To keep myself healthy, I study.
Για να διατηρηθώ υγιής, τρέφομαι σωστά.
Para mantenerme saludable, yo bailo.
Para mantenerme saludable, yo purifico mi espíritu a través del cuerpo. ¿Y tú?
Get your body. Tuesdays, only on TeleSUR.
It is our duty to reverse the damage we cause to the planet. Let's recover our natural ecosystems with actions in defense of the environment. Let's keep fighting for a greener world. Wednesdays, only on TeleSUR.
Welcome back to From the South. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov criticised the European Union this Tuesday, stressing it had destroyed the infrastructure of bilateral relations through its unilateral sanctions.
I underline one more time, we don't have relations with the European Union as an organization. The infrastructure of the relations was destroyed by Brussels' one-sided decisions. It's unacceptable to handle matters in the world with ultimatums and sanctions, compelling other countries to do a certain expected behavior. We have a proverb saying, love can't be forced. The United States hasn't learned this proverb, unfortunately, and act according to opposite positions.
China condemned the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom and the European Union after the latest announcement of sanctions on Chinese individuals and entities over alleged human rights violations in the country's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
What they have done is a slander and an offense to the reputation and dignity of the Chinese people, a blatant interference in China's internal affairs, and a serious infringement on China's sovereignty and security interests. These countries have claimed to be judges of human rights and acted as lecturers of human rights, but they actually have deplorable human rights record, and they are not in any position to blame China or even scapegoating China for their own crimes.
A gunman killed at least 10 people, including a police officer, at a grocery store in Colorado on Monday. The incident follows another mass shooting last week at Asian-owned spas in the southeastern state of Georgia that left 8 dead.
Suspect has been identified as Ahmad Alyssa, 21 of Arvada. He has been charged with 10 counts of murder in the first degree and will be shortly transported to Boulder County Jail.
And US Vice President Kamala Harris said the incident was absolutely tragic on referring to the death of a police officer in the Colorado shooting.
It's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. It's tragic. 10 people were going about their day, living their lives, not bothering anybody. A police officer who was performing his duties and with great courage and heroism. 7 children, I understand. It's tragic. It's tragic.
People aged over 69 are being vaccinated with China's Coronavac shot in the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, as the country faces a COVID-19 surge, which is again pushing hospitals to breaking point. The country has recorded the second highest number of COVID-19 deaths in the world after the United States, and the situation is worsening. The average daily death toll is currently the highest worldwide and has more than tripled since the start of the year to over 2,200. In the midst of this desperate situation, President Jair Bolsonaro announced last Monday that he was firing Health Minister and Army General Eduardo Pazuello and replacing him with cardiologist Marcelo Queiroga. And the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo recorded a new daily record of more than 1,000 COVID-19 related deaths in 24 hours. The state of Sao Paulo has reported over 67,000 COVID-19 deaths since the beginning of the pandemic and over 2.3 million cases. According to data from the National Council of Health Secretaries, the country has reached the peak of the epidemic, having reported a total of over 12 million cases and more than 295,000 deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. Uruguay reported a record number of daily new coronavirus cases on Monday. Health authorities in the South American nation reported more than 2,600 new cases, bringing the total to over 84,000, while 19 new COVID-19 related fatalities were confirmed, to bring the death toll to 811. Health workers are demanding new measures to fight the spread of the virus following the record numbers. Authorities have linked the increase in infections to the presence of the new Brazilian strain of the virus in the country. Another 500,000 doses of the Sputnik V vaccine arrived on Monday in Argentina from Russia, as the government warned of a possible second wave of coronavirus cases already affecting neighbouring countries.
As part of the national government, we are receiving 500,000 doses of Sputnik V vaccines, which means that we already have 3.3 million doses of Sputnik, and that we have reached 4.8 million doses in total, with other vaccines that are being distributed. The reality is that these are not a few vaccines in the global context. Notice that the president reported on Thursday that only 15 countries have received 10% of what vaccines they have asked for, and 88% of the vaccines have reached 18 countries. So you have to see the global context in relation to the vaccine production. And really, it's an important achievement that Argentina has maintained the arrival of vaccines and vaccinations since the end of December.
The Spanish government announced Tuesday that the country will lift restrictions on arrivals from the United Kingdom on March 30th. The measures have been in place since December to prevent the spread of new coronavirus strains. Meanwhile, restrictions on arrivals from Brazil and South Africa will be extended until April 30th.
The extension of the flight restriction is maintained with South Africa and Brazil, but not with the United Kingdom, and therefore the situation can now be normalized in relation to the Schengen area and the measures that must also be adopted within the framework of the Schengen area, which are, as you also remember, to have a recent PCR test that allows the transit of this person to another place.
After marathon talks with regional leaders, German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced the country will prolong its coronavirus restrictions until April 18th and enter a strict lockdown for 5 days over Easter in a bid to halt soaring infection rates.
For this reason, on April the 1st and April the 3rd are decreed as days of rest for once, with weight restrictions on contacts and a ban on gatherings from the 1st to the 5th of April. It is an extended period of rest during Easter.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us.
We share your feelings, exalt your accomplishments, ensure your reality. Our approach is global and keeps us in tune with the peoples. Caribbean countries also get our signal. With enthusiasm, we will continue to broadcast for them. Because we are TeleSUR, the news broadcaster from South America and the Caribbean.
Una travesía para descubrirnos. Buscamos conexiones perdidas.
No nos queda otra que luchar, porque no tenemos nada que perder.
Realmente es por todos.
Recorremos el mundo con Reportajes TeleSUR.
Saturdays. Only on TeleSUR.
Welcome back to From the South. The people of Syria have denounced that United States troops continue to loot oil from their territory. Local residents reported that US troops transferred 300 tank trucks of oil to Iraq. They assured that the convoy set off from the oil fields in Swedia, in Syria's northeastern Hasakeh province, and crossed into the neighbouring country through the illegal border crossing in Mahmoudiya. In the last few months, US soldiers have repeated this operation several times, depriving the country of its natural resources, such as oil and wheat. At least 15 people were killed after a devastating fire destroyed thousands of shelters in a Rohingya refugee camp in southern Bangladesh on Monday. According to a spokesperson for the United Nations Refugee Agency, about 400 people are still missing, including young children, and around 500 were injured in the fire, while some 45,000 people were displaced. Aid agencies were rushing emergency assistance to the tens of thousands of victims of the deadly blaze at the Balukhali camp in the Cox's Bazar district. A top government official said at least 3 of the dead were children, and the search for victims was still ongoing. Protesters blocked a highway outside the northwest Nigerian city of Kaduna on Monday to demand the release of kidnapped students. Since March 11th, gunmen have been holding 39 college students who were seized from hostels in a raid. The military rescued 180 other students and staff. The protesters blocked the road outside the Federal College of Forestry on the city's outskirts and pushed a tractor belonging to the college along the highway while mothers held posters of their children and pleaded for their rescue. The parents of the kidnapped students have criticised the government's handling of the case. Nearly 1/3 of Nigerian children lack access to enough water, according to UNICEF, which is calling for urgent measures to address the problem. In a statement, the United Nations Children's Fund said more than 1.42 billion people, including 450 million children across the world, are living in areas of high or extremely high water vulnerability. About 100,000 Nigerian children are said to die every year of water-related diseases, and over 86% of Nigerians lack access to a safely managed drinking water source. UNICEF said despite some progress by the country, there's still much more work to be done. Attackers on motorbikes raided several villages in southwestern Niger on Sunday, killing at least 137 people in the bloodiest violence to hit the country in years, according to the government. The gunmen attacked the villages of Itsayani, Bakorat and Wistain, located near the border with Mali, shooting at everything which moved, according to a local official. The coordinated raids underscore the greatest challenge facing Niger's new president, Mohamed Bazoum, whose election victory in a runoff vote last month was confirmed on Sunday by the country's top court. The country is struggling with armed campaigns that have spilled over from Mali and Nigeria, killing hundreds of people and displacing nearly 500,000 others. The head of the African Union Observer Mission to the presidential elections in the Republic of the Congo on Sunday congratulated the Congolese people following a calm and peaceful vote.
Congratulates the Congolese people for their calm mobilization and their commitment to democratic values. It also congratulates the government authorities the CENI, Independent National Electoral Commission, the political actors and the defense and security forces who work to hold an inclusive and peaceful election, consolidating the democratic achievements of the Republic of Congo. The mission remains attentive to the rest of the process, in particular decentralization, compilation, proclamation of results and litigation. It urges the candidates to respect the verdict of the ballot box and to use the legal channels of appeal in case of dispute.
The United Nations has stated that the situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is alarming according to data collected in 2020. According to a report by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 2,945 civilians, including 553 women and 286 children, were killed in 2020. Meanwhile, the UN Stabilization Mission in the country, known as MONUSCO, noted there's been a worrying increase in attacks by armed groups against the civilian population, in particular in the provinces of Ituri, North Kivu and South Kivu. The violations were committed by a range of armed groups which operate in vast areas of the country where, according to the UN, there is little or no presence of Congolese authorities. And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.
Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali analyzes the international media influence driven by the empire, access and analysis of political, economic and social life throughout Latin America through our stream and website in English. A critical space committed to truth to determine the conjuncture that moved the world today. The world today. Mondays on TeleSUR. Every year, thousands of people leave their homeland to reach new horizons. A reality of those people who struggle for their freedom. Know the diverse causes of those who live between borders. Thursdays, only on TeleSUR.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life. Fridays. Only on TeleSUR. Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali analyzes the international media influence driven by the empire, access and analysis of political, economic and social life throughout Latin America through our stream and website in English. A critical space committed to truth to determine the conjuncture that moved the world today. The world today. Mondays on TeleSUR. Who's moving the chessmen? What interests and motivate the actors behind each event? The board is deployed. Critical Move investigates every event from Monday to Friday. Only on TeleSUR. Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomy. Monday, only on TeleSUR.
En un mundo en constante movimiento, todos los días se generan nuevos sucesos y es necesario conocerlos. Nos preguntamos, ¿qué hay detrás de cada acontecimiento? ¿Cuáles son las consecuencias y cómo nos afectan? Ante estas preguntas, buscaremos poner el punto en la I.
dotting the I. Saturday, only on TeleSUR.
Una travesía para descubrirnos. Buscamos conexiones perdidas.
No nos queda otra que luchar, porque no tenemos nada que perder.
Realmente es por todos.
Recorremos el mundo con Reportajes TeleSUR.
Saturdays, only on TeleSUR. The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. TeleSUR documentaries. Sundays, only on TeleSUR.
You're watching TeleSUR English. I'm Katrina Goss and these are the headlines at this hour. The United Nations Human Rights Council has adopted by a majority vote the resolution on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. The resolution was approved with 30 votes in favour, 15 against and 2 abstentions. The meeting was held under Articles 155 and 156 of the UN Charter, which are the basis for delegitimising the unilateral sanctions that countries such as the United States and the European Union have imposed as a coercive policy. Following the approval of the resolution, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza criticised the nations that voted against the resolution and pointed out that as a matter of basic ethics, they should lose their seats on the Multilateral Council. The global calls for an end to the United States blockade imposed against Cuba are intensifying. Political, social, cultural and union organisations and leaders in different parts of Europe and Latin America are mobilising to demand an end to this hostile policy against Cuba and also express their support for the Global Caravan Initiative, demanding an end to the US blockade. At the same time, they insist on the need to increase international pressure on Washington and stress that the White House continues to systematically attack those free and sovereign states that do not respond to its interests. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov criticised the European Union this Tuesday, stressing it had destroyed the infrastructure of bilateral relations through its unilateral sanctions.
I underline one more time, we don't have relations with the European Union as an organization. The infrastructure of the relations was destroyed by Brussels' one-sided decisions. It's unacceptable to handle matters in the world with ultimatums and sanctions, compelling other countries to do a certain expected behavior. We have a proverb saying, love can't be forced. The United States hasn't learned this proverb, unfortunately, and act according to opposite positions.
The people of Syria have denounced that United States troops continue to loot oil from their territory. Local residents reported that US troops transferred 300 tank trucks of oil to Iraq. They assured that the convoy set off from the oil fields in Swaidea in Syria's northeastern Hasaka province and crossed into the neighbouring country through the legal border crossing in Mahmoudiya. In the last few months, US soldiers have repeated this operation several times, depriving the country of its natural resources such as oil and wheat. And those are the headlines at this hour. For these and more stories, go to our website at telesurenglish.net.
Welcome to the Health Informative of TeleSUR. This week we are going to talk about the impact of the economic blockade imposed over Venezuela and how this Caribbean nation has guaranteed its population access to healthcare in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. But first, let's make our custom informative tour of the week. Don't forget that you can write to our email guiatucuerpo@telesurtv.net. A new clinical blood analysis is available. This test locates a substance whose accumulation on the brain indicates the presence of Alzheimer's. Until today, the only way to diagnose this ailment was to take an expensive MRI. This new test will help to diagnose people with the symptoms compatible with this disease. Many elderly know with worry their loss of memory of mental faculties, considering them as possible signs of the beginning of a disease that they don't really suffer from. At the same time, often cognitive deficiencies have been wrongly for years attributed to psychological disorders until it's finally proven that they have Alzheimer's. In both cases, the question is if these intellectual disorders are a consequence of the regular aging or a more serious problem, debating themselves between the fear and the need to know the answer. Now, they can answer this question through a test made in the United States that has obtained the CE mark of the European Union, and that, according to the manufacturer, is the first blood-based test for this pathology that's available to the market. The test, called PrecivityAD, measures the concentration of two types of amyloid particles on the blood plasma, denominated as 42 and 40. This way, it reveals if there is a genetic element that augments the risk of suffering from this disease. India will send vaccines against COVID-19 to Syria, supporting the United Nations. The assistant representative of India before the United Nations organization declared that their nation supports the Syrian people in such a sorry situation and will mediate before the high authorities of the Conference of the United Nations on Human Rights. Antonio Guterres, General Secretary of the UN, complimented India for being a world leader on the reactionary efforts to the pandemic, providing medicine, diagnostic kits, ventilators, and personal protection gear to over 100 countries. Serbia donated 4,000 doses of the Sputnik V vaccine to Montenegro. The Serbian Prime Minister Ana Brnabić traveled to the capital of Montenegro with the first 2,000 doses of the Russian-made vaccine. The donation happened the same day that thousands of Serbian healthcare workers from Bosnia crossed to the country to receive an injection of the vaccine against COVID-19.
I express my gratitude to Serbia and to you in person for bringing this most valuable gift. These vaccines should protect the people of Montenegro. Health above all, and solidarity before anything.
The country of the Balkan Peninsula has begun to administer second doses, mainly with the Sinopharm vaccine from China, alongside the Russian Sputnik V and in lesser quantities the Pfizer-BioNTech injection. Serbia has been the leader of the deployment of vaccine, thanks to their solid relations with Russia and China. The country also donated 4,000 vaccines to Northern Macedonia. Now we invite you to watch our health ephemeris of the week. March 21st, World Down Syndrome Day. Commemorate a day to the people that have this life condition. The Down syndrome isn't a disease as most people think it is. This is a condition that happens when a genetic alteration appears on the chromosomes, the norm being that people have 46 chromosomes, but in the case of newborn babies with Downs, this number is higher. In the midst of Washington's offensive against the Caribbean nation, Venezuela and its people have resisted the destabilization attempts against a legitimately elected government. Since 2015, the government, then headed by Barack Obama, declared the country as a threat to the security of the United States, an unjustified action that looked to undermine the country's democracy and subject its population to the effects of criminal blockade. The economic sanctions against Venezuela have been expanded and hardened since 2015. With the first executive order from the United States, the objective was to create a social crisis to justify a forced change of government. The consequence, the suffering of girls, boys, women, men, and the elderly that suffer from the poverty and low quality of life that had gotten better thanks to social policies implemented in the country. The people that suffer from chronic diseases were the most affected. The executive order has been expanded, and through its combination of financial and economic prohibitions against the Venezuelan system have accumulated, affecting the most the healthcare sectors, above all by the coronavirus pandemic declared in March 2020. In spite of the impediment in the purchase of medical supplies, Venezuela has resisted the aggressions against their sovereignty. Since the arrival to power of the ex-president Hugo Chavez, coup d'etats, violence from the opposition, induced inflation, attacks to the national currency, and threats of military intervention. But the worst of all of them is the financial blockade, whose target is to keep on causing a social crisis in the midst of a pandemic. There is no legal justification for a country to intervene on the internal affairs of another country, and in the case of Venezuela, these actions are unilateral from a foreign government, goes against international law, after that gets worse during a sanitary emergency caused by the pandemic. Even though organizations, movements, and even the government itself have denounced these aggressions, they have been ignored. Nevertheless, according to a report contributed by the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations, Alina Duhan, the same have brought consequences to the life of innocent people.
I underline the inadmissibility of applying extraterritorial sanctions, and I urge the United States government to end the national emergency over Venezuela. Review and lift the sanctions against the Venezuelan public sector, to review and lift sanctions against third countries, and to abstain from imposing sanctions on diesel supplies that will cause a humanitarian crisis in unprecedented proportions.
During his intervention, the rapporteur urged the government of the United States, the European Union, and other states to review and lift the unilateral sanctions imposed on the South American nation, worried by the sanitary system affected by the lack of doctors, nurses, and insufficient medicines, medical gear, relevant software updates on the exercise of medicines, vaccines, tests, reactives, and contraceptives subsidized mostly by the government, will result in the violation of the right to medicine. Dohan highlighted the restriction access to essential spare parts for the functioning of machinery related to the water and electricity system, essential services for the fulfillment of the World Health Organization's orientations to prevent the virus. Since hygiene and alimentation are among the primary preventative cares.
Today, the rapporteur has urged the governments of the United States, the European Union, to review and lift the sanctions against Venezuela, because they exacerbated a gigantic and enormous humanitarian crisis against the people.
The coercive measures imposed on Washington against the main company of the country, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., under American subsidiary Citgo, have directly affected the special financing of medical treatments, surgical interventions, and transplants that this institution held for patients with chronic diseases. Out of fear of being sanctioned, banks and financial institutions systematically refused to process the payments. The freezing of the funds on American, Portuguese, British banks, among others, have prevented the purchase of vaccines against COVID-19. The rapporteur affirmed that all of the legal mechanisms must be used to allow the Venezuelan government to restore its social developmental projects. That's why she emphasized the dialogue, the higher law, and the respect to the human rights among states. She considered as a catastrophe effect on the quality of life of the Venezuelan people as a product of the criminal blockade. The President of Venezuela and the Human Rights Council signed a report from the rapporteur to manifest his concern about the situation of healthcare matters.
The country faced a dire scarcity of vaccines against measles, yellow fever, and malaria, as informed. The lack of tests and treatment for HIV in 2016-2018 caused the death of 5,000 persons. The division of assets of the American subsidiary of PDVSA, Citgo, has prevented liver and bone marrow transplant for 53 Venezuelan children.
Our nation faces a multidimensional war aimed at destroying the inductive social model built by the Bolivarian Revolution. Actions of unmeasured pressure, of persecution against our country, through the imposition of over 450 unilateral, coercive, and illegal measures that have resulted in a blockade and excessive persecution of the capabilities of the Venezuelan state and society by means of so-called sanctions. Venezuela has been deprived of at least $30 billion in cash that are property of the state overseas. Resources that should have been used to tend to the healthcare, alimentation, and the integral rights of the people. The kidnappers of these goods and resources of the Venezuelan state have shown unmeasurable cruelty. Even in the pandemic circumstance, they ignore the calls of the international community. The United Nations General Secretary, the High Commissioner, and especially the Venezuelan people. And they have boosted the economical aggression willingly, generating a premeditated humanitarian crisis.
Children that were attended by CUO through financial programs perished because they didn't receive transplants they required. The international sanctions also prevented the country from buying enough antiretroviral medicaments and reagents from the detention of HIV. Several organizations point out that during the pandemic, over 1,000 people have died due to the lack of medical treatments. To face the pandemic, Venezuela has counted on the Chinese and Russian vaccines.
We are starting to vaccinate. In this first stage, all of the medical, all of the sanitation workers, the 14,000 door-to-door brigades, all of the social work staff that also are going door to door permanently, tending needs.
The UN's report shows the difficulties that the Venezuelan people face thanks to the coercive measures against their country. It is expected that with the recommendations of the UN, this situation will improve and the Venezuelan state will regain their resources and the right to health care of their citizens that were infringed by foreign governments. This has been our main theme. Next, our positive note of the week. In the city of La Paz in Bolivia, free vaccination against COVID-19 for kidney disease patients has started. The recipient will be immunized with the Asiatic Giants vaccine, CoronaVac. In the positive note of the week, we will talk about the free and voluntary vaccination against COVID-19 that the patients of kidney disease will receive in Bolivia.
The patients of kidney disease consider that including them on vaccination is a new life opportunity.
They are seeing us so that we live a few more years, because with this disease, it was scary to go out. Going anywhere was unsafe. We all need it, especially people with chronic diseases.
The healthcare personnel and people with kidney disease or cancer are the ones with access to the immunization, and a schedule that takes into account the people at higher risk.
When the new batch of vaccines arrives, we're going to do work with patients that have HIV, tuberculosis, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and finally, we'll be working with patients that have chronic diseases.
The vaccination was manifested within the frame of a doctors and healthcare workers strike that started 10 days ago and expanded for another 15. With its own, I urge the doctors that insist on starting an absolutely political mobilization. Because all of the arguments they raised have already been overcome on practice in the fact. And the only thing we're seeing is that maybe they aren't on the level of this challenge of facing this pandemic. The people need doctors committed to their people, not their pockets. It has been identified that the healthcare personnel strike demands the annulment of the sanitary emergency law, which the leaders of these guilds agreed on with the government. Simple business. Humankind is much more important than personal and economical desires, than defending private clinics, than defending private healthcare before defending and guaranteeing that we have doctors by our side during this pandemic, saving lives, because when you vaccinate someone, you save a life. Vaccination in Bolivia is voluntary and free. The government committed themselves to the acquisition of 15 million vaccines from several laboratories to immunize 7.2 million persons over the age of 18, who are considered as the immunizable population of the country. Freddy Morales, TeleSUR, Bolivia.
We continue with our recommendations of the week. Protect yourself and others against COVID-19. Clean and disinfect surfaces frequently, especially those touched regularly. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. The hands touch many surfaces that could be infected. Wash your hands periodically and carefully with water and soap. This eliminates germs that could be in your hands, even the viruses. When coughing or sneezing, cover the mouth and nose with the elbow flexed or with a disposable tissue. Use your face mask correctly in a manner that covers your mouth and nose, securely under the chin. You can protect people in your environment against the viruses that cause colds, the flu, and COVID-19. Avoid the crowds found in places like restaurants, bars, gyms, or cinemas. This boosts the risk of exposure to COVID-19. With these recommendations, we have reached the end of Health Informative. We say goodbye for today. Remember that you can contact us through our email, guiatucuerpo@telesurtv.net. See you next week.
En un mundo en constante movimiento, todos los días se generan nuevos sucesos y es necesario conocerlos. Nos preguntamos, ¿qué hay detrás de cada acontecimiento? ¿Cuáles son las consecuencias y cómo nos afectan? Ante estas preguntas, buscaremos poner el punto en la I.
Dot in the I. Saturday, only on TeleSUR.
Follow the most important global events through a comprehensive perspective. With a team of journalists in 25 locations around the world to convey our people's reality. From the South. Weekdays. Only on TeleSUR.
Who's moving the chessmen? What interests and motivate the actors behind each event? The board is deployed there. Critical Move investigates every event from Monday to Friday. Only on TeleSUR. Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali analyzes the international media influence driven by the empire, access and analysis of political, economic and social life throughout Latin America through our stream and website in English. A critical space committed to truth to determine the conjuncture that moved the world today. The world today. Mondays on TeleSUR. Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomy. Monday, only on TeleSUR.
为了保持身体健康，我冥想。
Para mantenerme saludable, yo corro.
To keep myself healthy, I study.
Για να διατηρηθώ υγιής, τρέφομαι σωστά.
Para mantenerme saludable, yo bailo.
Para mantenerme saludable, yo purifico mi espíritu a través del cuerpo. ¿Y tú?
Get your body. Tuesdays, only on TeleSUR.
It is our duty to reverse the damage we cause to the planet. Let's recover our natural ecosystems with actions in defense of the environment. Let's keep fighting for a greener world. Wednesdays, only on TeleSUR. The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. TeleSUR documentaries. Sundays, only on TeleSUR. Every year, thousands of people leave their homeland to reach new horizons. A reality of those people who struggle for their freedom. Know the diverse causes of those who live between borders. Thursdays, only on TeleSUR.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Sean todos muy bienvenidos a Vidas. Hay lugares donde el arte se unifica con el orgullo de los pueblos. Y esos lugares están llenos de colores, alegría, pasión, tradiciones, arraigo, valor y entrega.
Real Life. Fridays. Only on TeleSUR.
– 2017 marks the centennial of one of the biggest events in human history. 100 years ago, a huge chunk of the planet became ruled by workers and peasants with a socialist economy, with the success of the Russian Revolution. 14 other nations joined Russia into what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, shifting a balance of power in a world that had long been dominated by lords and barons. Critics and supporters can agree. The Soviet Union shook the world, ushering in a period of social revolution, breaking of old colonial bonds, and a challenge to the reigning system of capitalism. All of that started on November 7, 1917. To learn more about this event, I sat down with Brian Becker, longtime socialist organizer and co-author of the new book Storming the Gates: How the Russian Revolution Changed the World. So can you set the stage for the revolution in Russia in 1917 and what was happening both locally and globally that sparked it?
Well, the big context, the big picture for the Russian Revolution was a country that spanned all the way from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. In other words, the largest landmass of any country in the world. A country that had been ruled by an emperor, the Tsar. For 300 years, the Romanov family dominated. In 1917, 75% of the country were peasants. 96% of the peasants were illiterate. There had been tempestuous industrial growth in the last years before the Russian Revolution as a consequence of foreign direct investment, mainly from France. But in general, this was a society that had remained static for 3 centuries. The monarchy had become decrepit. It had a bad leadership under the Tsar, the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II. Most importantly, the Russian Empire had suffered major military defeats in 1905 in the war with Japan, a humiliating defeat. And then in the World War I, 3 million plus Russians died. There was no end to the war. And the consequence of that was that the people in Russia could not eat. The peasants were at the front. They wanted to go home to the farms. And so economic misery and discontent was growing. The Russian Revolution, well, there were really 2 revolutions. The February Revolution started on International Women's Day when women went out on strike protesting their immiseration. And suddenly, surprisingly, within 3 or 4 days, the Tsar was vanquished. That wasn't carried out by the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks or the Social Revolutionaries or any political party. It was an entirely spontaneous mass movement that the Tsar himself, the day before the revolution, where he loses leadership, he's writing in his diary, I took a walk today, I had tea today. In other words, a leadership that was completely removed from the realities of his own country and his own people.
Mm-hmm. What sectors of Russian society comprised of the revolution, and what role did they play?
There were two basic classes. Of course, we know from the flag of the Soviet Union, it was the hammer representing the workers and the sickle representing the tool of the peasants. Those were the two classes. You had the urban workers in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, a few other industrial cities. But again, as I said, 75% of the country